I wish to make a complaint.
Sorry, we're closing for lunch.
Never mind that, my lad. I wish to complain about this parrot what I purchased not half an hour ago from this very boutique.
Oh, yes, the Norwegian blue. What's wrong with it?
I'll tell you what's wrong with it. It's dead. That's what's wrong with it.
In response to the revelation that the intelligence services are controlling speech online and really throughout society, now that that's kind of publicly known, one of the things that people on the left will retreat to is saying, well, the free market, what do you want? You want everything to be determined by the free market? Don't you think that there needs to be some sort of regulations put in place on these corporations? My response that I'm developing this response, because I think I just took it for granted all along, and now I have to articulate it, is that while the free market isn't free, that is actually the problem with the market. It's not that the problem with the free market is that it's too free, right? But that it's constrained by the capitalist mode of production, is what I'll say. And so the socialist wants to develop free exchange,
right,
from a free people. Production for use is one way of saying it, but we want to free society from constraints. To say what we want instead is to have the most concentrated form of capital around, which is right now the U.S. state, be able to regulate every individual's thoughts and opinions and expressions and what they hear, is definitely walking away from the aim of socialism. That's how I think.
Right. So it's tricky because there are different levels of mediation, right? So there is market socialism as a theory, right?
Right.
And then it's turned into, or like anarchists have this idea too, which is, like worker control of production at a local level, kind of shop floor democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And then what you have is a free market among such worker-owned cooperatives, basically.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And, obviously that is what Marxists called reactionary socialism or petty bourgeois socialism,
mm-hmm.
right? That's a kind of a petty bourgeois fantasy. And so, we do have accumulated and concentrated and centralized capital. We do. And yes, it's an oppressive force and, whatnot. But the point is not to withdraw from that or tear it down or destroy it or simply negate it, but to reappropriate it. Right. And so I know that we've talked about this before, why someone like Lenin was not against one-man administration, against bosses. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Because the idea is that the working class's democratic control of production wouldn't operate at that level, but would operate at a societal level in terms of societal priorities. And some of those things could be planned and determined politically and even bureaucratically, technocratically even. But many things could not be. And so there's probably a role for the market or for a market mechanism in that, transition. Really, because what we're talking about, we can only sort of envision what might be the initial stages of a transition beyond capitalism. That at first, what you're doing is a political reappropriation of capital. That's what you're doing, which means that you are actually preserving capital. You're saving capital from the capitalists, which again, it looks like, well, why not just have the capitalist state, the liberal democracy that we have now, do that? And there are all sorts of reasons why that's unlikely to happen. Hypothetically, it could happen, but also you come up against the nation state as a problem, meaning that you'd actually need a political appropriation of capital that isn't based on the existing capitalist nation states in order for it to actually be a social appropriation as opposed to merely a nationalization.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, like I said, the point is to understand that there are different levels. And obviously, even if you have one-man management, that doesn't mean that you don't want, strong labor unions, that you don't want the workers to not have the ability to countermand or generally counter that centralized management. I was just thinking about it in the shower today, Doug. I was just thinking, not everybody wants to be a boss, right? And so, do I want to go to like meetings where I determine like our all work policy? No. Maybe I just want to be an employee and have the boss tell me what to do. And that's fine as long as it's within certain limits, right, that are established at a greater societal level that I might have a say in. But otherwise, one might delegate the task. One might say, I'm going to allow this person to tell me what to do. That's their role, right? They think about that stuff, and I think about this particular task I'm doing right here, right now, right? And so the idea that we're going to like democratize the economy, democratize anything and everything, that's like a petty bourgeois fantasy. It is a petty bourgeois fantasy, and it's not. It's kind of internally incoherent and contradictory given the realities that we have, and also the social trajectory that we've been on. So what you're talking about here is like basically, I think that the debate that you're talking about is how to treat these internet companies. Are they public utilities? Or are they like basically publications, like press establishments? Are they like a newspaper or are they like an electric company? Right? And so again, I always like to say, like, look, yes, we're Marxists and we're socialists and we're utopians in that way, but also let's look at how capitalism now handles it. And there are rational ways. In other words, there are like for-profit public utilities that are basically operating as monopolies, right? And that are not immediately under state control, but are regulated in some way. And again, it's understood that that's the role that they play. They're not really competing with each other. And it gets back to what we were talking about in the first half about like corporate taxes, where they go. They go to infrastructure, right? They go to things that have a general benefit for the conditions of capitalism, rather than simply being a benefit to the public, because it's the benefit to the public. Well, what is the public? And we've talked about this before: the public interest in capitalism, meaning the working class has an interest in capital flourishing, in capitalist corporations succeeding. It would be against the working class's interest to have all the capitalist corporations go bankrupt, right? And so then what are we talking about, right? And yes, in an immediate sense, the capitalist corporations need certain infrastructure in order to do what they do. And so maybe they should pay for that, right? And then, those of us who have to work for them shouldn't have to pay for it, shouldn't pay taxes, right? So again, it's really the question of like infrastructure and how that's handled. Is it a public utility? Is it a private utility? But again, I think that part of the discussion has been, because there has been, Democrats have discussed regulating the internet companies, like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, well,
right, they have, and they've basically been like, they should be regulated like utilities. And it's like, okay, that's like a rational approach. It is. Like, in other words, we don't have to jump to socialism. We really don't. We can just say,
look, there's a big difference between regulating the energy sector and regulating speech online or anywhere.
It's not speech anymore, Doug. It's information. And we're long down that highway. In other words, that wasn't just yesterday. Like the disinformation, misinformation, like basically information is a commodity. We do live in the information age, the information economy. We do. And people do make money on basically intellectual property. Right. And, you're not supposed to download songs for free anymore. And so that's why you have to go to some Russian website to download a pop song that you don't feel like paying Amazon for, because you already pay Amazon everything else. And so you're really going to pay $1.99 to hear a song? No, you're going to download it from a Russian website. And yes, it's going to come with a Trojan horse that is going to like help take over the US by Vladimir Putin or whatever. So, so the question is, what is it? It's information. It's not speech. It's information. And information is
okay, but the left
is a public good, and we shouldn't have adulterated information, right? No. I mean, it really is like that. It's like should there be adulterated chicken in the store? Should there be adulterated information on the internet? Let's just think about how the capitalists are trying to deal with it, right? Because it's a new economic form.
But
new
look,
concrete economic form, and they're like, yeah, you don't want adulterated meat, you don't want adulterated information. It's a little bit like that, a little bit. I mean, obviously, it's supercharged politically now.
Well, but, I mean, it is. I just don't accept the analogy of the free press being treated like the butchers and right. Right, but it's not. Yeah,
it is a good.
It is a commodity. Yes, it is a commodity, but it is not the same qualitatively as any other commodity. It is quantitatively the same, and yes, you can say that property rights attached to the creators of intellectual property. And
I mean, what we want is free public discourse.
Huh?
What we want is free public discourse, right?
Right. Well, look, if you want to have these social media platforms operate as a public space, as a public virtual, town square, then the rules that would be applied would be the rules of law, which would include the Constitution. It wouldn't mean that there wouldn't be a way to stop fraud or extreme, child pornography or libel.
What we're really talking about is like the thought control element that the left really likes, right? So they think that like it's bad for people to have a homophobic thought or a racist thought, and they want to police that. They really want to do that. The left wants to do that. They do. Let's not kid ourselves. They want to punish you for what you're thinking and what you're feeling. And so, my attitude is, well, no, right? In other words, I can say I don't approve of people getting, I don't know what, caught up in some racial fantasy, some racism, getting like themselves worked up into a lather with like racist ideas. I can say that and say it's morally bad and I would want to fight those ideas, and saying if someone is caught browsing a racist website, they should lose their job. No. I'm sorry, no. No. They should not lose their job. They shouldn't lose their job for being a member of the KKK. They should not. Sorry, no.
Okay, and I agree, but I just want to
maybe
point out
lose their job if they actually commit violence.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
You know what I mean? But no.
But, what I want to say here is that, as it stands right now, okay, the way
I just don't think we're going to achieve socialism by having the capitalist state arrest all the racists.
Oh, I agree with you.
I don't think that's going to happen. That's not our path. That's not the road. That's not going in the right direction. That's just not it. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
and so there's a difference in the law and morality.
Yeah,
there are things I disapprove of morally that I don't want the state to punish people for.
I agree 100%, and so that part I totally agree with. My point though is that just to get a picture of the moment, right? We're talking about a moment where, using Trump as a state of exception,
right?
The Department of Homeland Security declared all of the communication infrastructure in the country to be in its jurisdiction, and then based on that set up a network of cutout organizations and internal organizations within Department of Homeland Security, like CISA, to monitor and suppress speech that was threatening to national security in some way or another, whether it was from a foreign country or from within. And that included basically all political speech that was determined to be opposed to the political interests of the current state.
And so more specifically of the Democrats too.
Well, that is the political interest of the current federal state, for the most part.
I mean, obviously the state has its own interests. It does cover its own ass and protect.
Right, but in the face of the and I feel as though the neoconservatives, the state bureaucracy, and the Democrats all unified against the populist threat.
Oh, they did. They did.
So that's
not some kind of a stable thing, though. In other words, this is all fluid. I mean, definitely there's like, I mean, the way that I put it is, because the other thing about like Trump or whatever, right, is that I always like to joke when he was in office, because people are like, okay, well, he's in power now. Like people in Platypus are like, okay, it's one thing for you to say this and that before he was elected, but now he is the president. And he has the whole state apparatus and the whole Republican Party and this whole like Congress, congressional delegation of Republicans and all these Republican governors on his side. And I'm like, does he? No. I was like, nobody is on Trump's side except for maybe Ivanka, and probably not even. Do you know? And so they turned it into that. And so it's this peculiar time that we're living in where it's literally about one guy.
Right.
It's like very strange. And what it does is,
but they're going to change it. If DeSantis gets the nomination, they're going to definitely shift it over. People are already saying he is worse than Trump. He is more of a threat.
That's to prevent him from being elected. If he's elected, they may not treat him exactly the same way in terms of, right? Because he will be seen as controllable. In other words, he is a return to the Republicans as a kind of a controlled opposition. And it's just, but for me, it doesn't mean that Trump is particularly special or good or anything like that. What it does is the peculiarity of the situation just highlights. It's like a funny light is cast on the status quo by this phenomenon, by the Trump phenomenon. And then it lets you see, albeit in a distorted, like it's like chiaroscuro lighting or something. You can see how the gears and the mechanisms work, and maybe not clearly, but you can see something that you otherwise would be sort of transparent, seamless operations, and that we'd have no reason to question, right? And so the only reason that we'd have to question it now is not because Trump is good or anything like that, but because, if they do this to Trump, imagine what they would do to
absolutely. Well, I want to talk about the war on terror because I want to just reiterate that my point that we shouldn't treat newspapers and magazines and books as if they need to be regulated the same way that bologna.
I will say one thing about that though. So there was back in the day, since we're the same generation. So in the manufacturing consent era of the 80s, there was this funny quip that you'd hear, which is that the only real news in the newspaper is in the business section. Did you ever hear that quip?
Yeah.
That everything else is just nothing, right? And so you say there shouldn't be laws regulating this or that. There actually are laws regulating what's reported in the business section.
Say more.
The numbers, right? Because what do people really, what do the capitalists need the press for? What does the public need to be informed about? They actually need to be informed about like the corporate sector of capitalism. They need to like know stock prices and commodity prices and trends. And so that information is actually highly regulated because you're not allowed to play fast and loose with that without some kind of legal liability, because actually it's been determined that it would actually harm the public to misreport those facts. Political facts aren't in the same category. And the fact that they might try to make them into the same kind of thing is treacherous. But they
so
can
if I write an
article
article for the New York Times and I say Twitter's stocks are worth more than they ever have been, and I'm wrong, they're lower than ever.
If you have actual numbers that are incorrect, that's an actual liability for the paper. Legally,
Twitter could sue me.
Yes.
Twitter could sue me for libel.
But other people also in the stock market public could also, right? They could say, well,
someone who bought stocks based on my numbers.
But also someone who might have right, exactly, who might have a share interest in a rival company might say that you're artificially, that you're affecting, right? And so there are, because my partner works for an accounting firm, right? There's some information where you're pretty strictly regulated in what you're allowed and not allowed to say.
What
Right.
I want to underscore, and I've underscored again and again, is that when you hear the word disinformation,
Mm-hmm.
they're using that and they're not saying fraud. They're not saying libel.
Do you
They're
know
not
why?
saying
Because
obscenity.
that would be
I know
different
why.
criteria, right?
Right. I know
Then they'd
why.
have to be
Because
responsible about it. Whereas now
right.
they can use this kind of slippage. Yeah.
Right. Disinformation is an extra legal uh, policy done by the intelligence agencies against the public. It is not
That
the same.
masquerades as like a kind of a legal responsible category, but
I mean,
isn't.
we can
Right.
debate about how information is actually regulated in our society. We could debate the FCC, right? We could look at the history of the way that broadcasting is regulated, or what counted as obscenity, and how people have had to constantly
Or
fight
even
against that.
the fairness doctrine.
Yeah,
The
we
fact
could
that you had
debate,
to have both sides,
which is
which
gone,
was which
but
is
right,
gone. But the reason that it's gone is that it was actually seen as too restrictive,
right,
right?
yeah,
And now we might want it, but we'd want it as a restriction. In other words, we might want it because it might appear to open things up, but actually it would be to close things down.
right. Right, exactly. But when we hear about disinformation, none of those old terms are really applying here.
Right.
This is directly attacking the right of
Well, that's the doublespeak you were
companies.
talking about earlier.
Right,
It is like a very deliberate doublespeak that we're being subjected to.
right. So that's what that's why I kind of like want to like, no, it's information and
Well, we
speech
want
is not
young
baloney.
people. Yes.
And to the extent that it is baloney, it's already being dealt with by the legal system when it comes to property rights,
Yes.
fraud,
Right.
libel. These things are already
They're already
legally
there.
defined.
Yeah, we
So
don't need this.
this is not
bullshit.
about any
Right.
of that. This is about directly controlling what people think politically right now. I mean, and you know what? By the way, during the pandemic, it was also about political thought. It just
Yes.
wasn't. It was couched as if everything
No,
was
that's
health.
what, by the way, technocracy, right?
Mhm,
So it's like, or bureaucracy. It's kind of like, there are people who have technical expertise, and
Right.
there are experts. There are bureaus of experts, and we do need expert people in this kind of society, or really in any society. You do need people who are specially trained and educated. It doesn't mean that their education and their training and their skills shouldn't be questioned, but it also means that there's a rationale to allowing them to police their own disciplines, to have their own like peer review, whatever you want to call it, that kind of thing. Because I was thinking about like science, like scientific journals aren't regulated the way like reporting of commercial facts in the business section of a newspaper are regulated, right? Even though you would think, okay, it's just as consequential, isn't it? But it's regulated differently. It's self-regulated by the scientific community. And, there's a rationale to that, right? There is. And so, obviously, like incorrect facts are potentially harmful in all sorts of ways, but we allow for a certain public discourse to take place. And that's why, what happened with COVID was a kind of fudging of the difference between public health policy and science, right? Where it was immediately short-circuited into facts. And it's like, well, wait, facts can be disputed in science. They couldn't be disputed as far as public health policy was concerned, right? Because you needed the government to basically say this is the policy, so that companies could say we're following the policy, so we're not liable. That's the reason. That's the actual reason that there is a public health policy. Right. Because it's not like, these twee European countries where the police will literally go and do things. There was basically the corporate America policed COVID, right? It's not like the cops came for you. It's not like in Australia when someone who was under quarantine was seen leaving their apartment, they did a manhunt and arrested the guy, right? It was more like, companies were going to let people come to work, not let them come to work, let them keep their job, not let them keep their job based on a public health recommendation. Right. And so is that an outsourcing of the state function to the corporate sector? Not really, not exactly. Right. But what it does is we need to understand why there is such a thing as public health policy at all.
Right.
Why does the government mandate these things, especially when it doesn't really mandate these things? You know, like the federal government can't mandate anything. It's got to be at a state level. And even the state government doesn't really mandate. They just set guidelines that then everyone adheres to in order to cover their asses. And that's the real reason. In other words, you can make workers come back to work if the government says it's safe if everyone's vaccinated. So that no one can sue you for giving us COVID by forcing us to come back to work. That's how it actually operates. But of course, the credulous public have magical thinking, and they think that this is like a moral issue, and it's like the truth, and do you believe in the truth, and it's science. Like, they don't understand that's not why we have public health guidelines. There's a really practical and legal liability reasons for these things. It's not some kind of like Saint Fauci, you know, goes up the mountain and hears from God and comes down and gives us the commandments, right? But the infantilism of it all, right? And then it's like, if you're left wing, if you believe the public health guidelines, and you're right wing if you don't believe the public health guidelines. And it's like, no, this is a totally practical thing that we can be sober about. We don't have to be superstitious and magical about it.
But you know, the people who were most superstitious about it, I think, were the technocrats themselves. And by that, I don't mean
the foot soldiers.
The people who, for instance, in the virality project, they would target any information that made Dr. Fauci look bad, like the reporting on his emails that were leaked. They would target any and all criticism of Fauci. They would also target any stories.
I mean, by the way, I will defend the right of bureaucrats to have private communications that are not divulged to the public. Because it could be that if you can't have that kind of frank communication between people, that you can't have them do their job effectively. It's possible.
Right.
Possible.
But in that particular instance, though, what came out was that there was a rush to judgment around the origin of the virus that, you know, demonstrated.
Otherwise, what? Public bureaucrats have to have their emails divulged, but private corporate CEOs don't? Right? Do you know what I mean? Like, you know, and it's fine, you know. And
I don't know how did we even get a hold of those emails? Was it through a FOIA?
I think it was FOIA. I think it was. I don't think it was a leak. I think it was FOIA. I don't think it was a hack. No, I think it was FOIA. Because you can be sure if it was a hack, they would have arrested people, you know.
Right. Yeah.
Because then it would have been like putting Fauci's life in danger. And right.
Yeah. Well, whether or not I kind of think I think FOIA is okay for bureaucrats, but I'm not sure.
But they also, they can say we can't release this.
Right. In this case, they were released, and but the point is not that particular detail. The point is that not only did
holding the rationality of the way things are done now. In other words, the basic rationality of the way things are done now, and understand that rationality, it's like a Lukács idea, or like I said, a Marcuse idea or something, which is that there's partial rationality or particular rationality, meaning in any given domain, things are done rationally within an overall irrational social system.
Right. But this particular action from the Department of Homeland Security used a state of exception to break from the legal system, which is a kind of rationality.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and it was much more nakedly
arbitrary. Yeah.
Arbitrary and in the interest,
and
the immediate interest,
politically tendentious. Yes.
Yeah. And the other example for me of the technocracy rather than democracy or constitutional republicanism, but the technocracy ruling would be the way, not that they have the right to peer review and they have their own little domains or some things are regulated and some aren't, but this moment during the pandemic where
it's the political arrogation. Yes.
Yeah. Well, all these healthcare professionals signed a letter saying, well, anti-Black racism is a bigger health crisis than COVID, so therefore we support the protests in the street and think that the COVID restrictions should be lifted in this.
I mean, all of that was, pretty transparent. meaning it's kind of like they understood that the lockdowns were not really anything. They did. In other words, it was basically social distancing. You know, again, flattening the curve, slowing the transmission, whatever. And they were just like, they basically decided it would be wrong to arrest black people for protesting against George Floyd's murder under the cover of COVID restrictions. And so, which it would be. But
was it any more wrong to do that than to arrest people who were protesting the lockdowns themselves?
Maybe it is more wrong because whatever, the history of racism and the disadvantage of black people and the disproportionate impact of police violence on black people, maybe it would be more wrong to suppress Black Lives Matter protests.
But that's not, they're not in these healthcare professionals.
For spurious reason, right?
These healthcare professionals are not a replacement for the public and politics. If we want to say, okay, it's more wrong, we want to make a different kind of set of criteria, we want to have affirmative action for public protests, then campaign for it, get it on,
make it
legislate
clear.
it. Right?
Don't hide behind, really, racism is more of a public health risk than COVID, and so therefore, again, that was just sophistry, and really spurious.
But it was. I think the people who signed that letter believed it, and
they definitely believed it, and that's why those people shouldn't be in charge. In other words, particular experts in specific fields should not be in charge of overall public policy. They should not. I mean, this is why I thought Fauci was more honest under Trump, because Fauci was like, well, I'm looking at it he said, I'm looking at it from a particular angle and with certain concerns, but balancing that against the needs of keeping the economy going, that's above my pay grade, so to speak. That's for someone else to decide. Right? And then it was like, oh, well, the Democrats campaigned on, we're going to do whatever Fauci says. Whereas under Trump, Fauci was like, well, you know what? I really can't make that decision.
Right.
About what's good for public health versus what's good for economic health. I wouldn't even begin to be able to adjudicate that. That's for someone else to decide. In other words, you have economic experts and you have public health experts in an administration, and they debate, and then the president decides, because after all, that's what he's elected to do. He hears the different experts and he says, I'm going to prioritize this over that. Okay.
Yeah, he's not even really an expert. He's a representative.
I know.
Right?
He's not even, right? I know. He's more like a spokesmodel for virologists or something, right?
Well, no. I'm talking about the president.
Oh,
the president is not an expert.
He's
our elected representative. He's supposed to enact the will of his constituents. He's not
exactly.
He's not
and he's
turning to the books and saying, okay. I mean, he could do that, but
not. No, they're not going to do that. And they are going to do something like, you know what? Am I more likely to be reelected if I prioritize the economy over public health or not? But you know what? That's politics. That's fine. In other words, that sounds horrific. You're going to leave it up to an electoral consideration. Isn't that horrible? No.
The only reason that's bad is because a good portion of that is, will I get more funding from these different sectors and these big donors?
Could be, or it could just be pure demagogy. And then again, the onus is on the public. In other words, if it's the case that the lockdowns are really unpopular and the people are going to vote against the lockdowns, then maybe you should have handled the lockdowns differently. But I think the left, in order to get more public support, I think the left is sometimes you need the state to tell people what to do, and fuck what they think, and don't let them vote on it. Because if you let them vote on it, it will be bad. And it's or you could try to convince the public. Do you know, it's you could do politics. And yes, you'd have to engage in rhetoric and some demagogy or something. You'd have to do something to try to convince people of something.
This brings me to an issue that is perhaps even more fraught with danger than the child pornography one, although perhaps not. But this brings us to a really fraught issue, which is the transgender debates that are going on right now. And I will frequently hear from people on the left that that they want to stamp out all attempts to erase trans people, that this is a matter of genocide. This is basically akin to genocide. And that, these debates about gender affirming care or whatever it might be, amount to
An existential question.
an
Trans women
existential.
are women, and my being trans is not an
But
object of debate. Like
I
these are
remember
posters at my school.
in 1992 in Oregon,
Mhm.
there was something called Measure 9 on the ballot,
Mm.
organized by far right Christian groups and other groups in Oregon to make it impossible for future legislators to pass rights, new rights or legislation to protect the rights of gay people in Oregon, that would no longer be allowed, and to permanently bar any efforts to create a legal category of gay marriage in Oregon. This was in 1992.
Mhm.
And also
The Defense of
to
Marriage Act.
classify homosexuality as deviant behavior, and something along the lines of immoral, something that to be stamped out. Okay, that was 1992 legislation in Oregon, and it brought people on the left into a panic, but it also brought a lot of different people on the left together to campaign against it, and it lost, right?
Yeah.
And that
It was a public debate.
yeah, that losing in Oregon changed the culture of Oregon. It changed the way gay people were perceived in Oregon. Everyone had to come forward and say,
and I'm
actually,
sure
I support homosexuals. I don't think they're deviants. I'm not going to just
probably had a national effect too.
yeah.
Right. In other words, that tactic by the
Mhm.
right
Mhm.
was being tested out in a way, and so it was seen maybe seen as like a bad strategy.
Yeah, it was actually a desperate act.
Uh-huh.
Because if things had not been already opening up, if homosexuality was not being accepted, if there wasn't already a movement for gay marriage, this wouldn't have been necessary. They wouldn't have.
It's funny, the gay marriage debate and also the sodomy debate, like the Supreme Court debate, since this is how these things were ultimately adjudicated. They were adjudicated by the 9 Olympians in robes, with their lifetime appointments, which I may not have a problem with, by the way. In other words, it's fine. It's a check. It's a check. It is a check and a balance against the legislature, and fine, right? Maybe we need that. But they argued it. I read the Supreme Court decision and the dissension on both the sodomy case and the gay marriage case, and they definitely argued it on the basis of evolving norms in society, evolving norms in the culture, right? And which again is a little bit hair raising, because it's like, wait, in principle, and it was the right that was like, well, shouldn't we uphold legal principles regardless of changing historical norms? Because historical norms can change for the worse, right? Like, I don't know, the Dred Scott decision was based on like historical norms, but it was still like wrong, right? And maybe even wrong on legal principle, wrong, right? And so, should we cater to changing norms? Because that isn't always a good thing, right? And and I think that it's very tricky, isn't it? Because then it raises the question of, are they legislating from the bench, and is that their role? That's not really their role, actually. Right? It should be based on something more of principled character to it. It should be based on like civil liberties, essentially, against the state. In other words, the state should not prevent gay people from getting married.
Right.
It's not like, should the state support gay people getting married? It's more like, should the state prevent them from getting married?
Right.
And so, they should have decided in 1789.
Right.
The state can't prevent gay people from getting married. By all
Seems
right.
unlikely that they would have, but yeah.
They might have. I mean, that in the Enlightenment, people were talking about all sorts of things. They were talking about women's equality. They were talking about sexual freedom. They were looking at these sodomy laws and being like, you know what? Nah, isn't this a holdover from some religious nonsense? They, it's not like again, the 60s really dominates us. It's not like people didn't know that there was a problem before the 1960s, before Stonewall. They knew. Right. They knew.
Right.
They did. And so, but again, it's kind of like, what's the real rationale here, and what's the soundness of these legal decisions? So it's just one of these funny things, right? Where I feel like using the state to affect public opinion, very tricky, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Because shouldn't we be using public opinion to affect the state?
Right. Within limits of, good, sound law, I think.
Well, the state
in this system, because of the need of the police and the contradictions within capitalism, we have
the state should have as much limitation on it as possible.
Right.
It really should have as much limitation on it as possible, and there should be as much civil social freedom as possible.
Yeah.
And really, that basic liberal idea.
Yeah, this is what I am trying to get across to people on the left in a way that I haven't been before, because I think first of all, maybe I didn't understand it as fully as I believed I did. Okay. And secondly, because I thought a lot of it was I just took a lot of it for granted. Like, of
we're
course,
living through times that cause us to rethink things, and that's a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have to think about it. I mean, the problem is that too many people don't want to think about it.
Right. Yeah. And I think maybe I have maybe my anger at times with people who are pushing against me is me, in a way, acting the same way that I'm trying to object to. Like,
possibly, but I think you're getting angry at the fact that people don't want to think about it. And we should be angered by that, or at least frustrated or something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, when I get the same comments back again and again, no matter how many times I patiently,
they're warding it off, they're shielding themselves, they don't want to think about it too much. And
what is it about this particular this particular issue that is so threatening? I feel like it's unique too, because it's not like any of the others. It's like I am not standing on. Go ahead.
Similar. I think that trans is a new issue.
No, not trans. Disinformation.
The disinformation question. Question. Right. No, I thought we were still talking about like.
No, I don't really. I'm not going to press people on the trans. I mean, like, I feel like that's not
one thing. I'll just say one thing just to be provocative.
Okay.
Right. So, I like to say that like historical Marxism and socialism was for like what we would now call gay rights and sexual rights and even trans rights, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And then Marxism and socialism and communism went through a conservative phase in the mid-20th century around Stalinism,
mm-hmm.
in which they, basically once they had state power in Soviet Union, China, Eastern Europe, right? Then they started making concessions to popular morality. That's what happened. Mm-hmm. It's not, it's basically they were like, this old Marxist program, it doesn't really fly with the general population. The general population are very heterosexual, heteronormative, traditional about gender roles and family and whatever. And so they just accepted it and then dressed it up as like, this is socialism, right? Mm-hmm. And homosexuality is capitalist decadence. And, it's the product of social breakdown under capitalism. And so in our socialist state, we don't have homosexuality because we don't have the social problems that they have in capitalism that twists people and turns them into homosexuals. And so they were very anti-homosexual, obviously. And, I'm just willing to say, like, I'm gay or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm willing to say, okay, I'm not going to uphold, like, that homosexuality is, like, just healthy and great and, positive and everybody's got to embrace it. Because, it's kind of a miserable sexual subculture in which people are strangely antisocial. Like, in other words, the Stalinist line on homosexuality, that it's like narcissistic and antisocial and, there's a kernel of truth to it. Of course there is. There is. Right? And so it's not like, it's not like I'm going to say, oh, well, it's good. I'm just going to say, should people like attack other people in civil society, and should the state arrest and abuse people on the basis of their deviant sexuality? In other words, I'm not going to say it's not deviant.
Right. But I would just say,
It
as
is
a
deviant, and maybe it is antisocial, and maybe I did fail in my social responsibility to not be heterosexual and have children. I mean, fuck.
okay,
I mean, you know,
okay, maybe you did, and
maybe. I'm just willing to admit.
I want to tell you, as a
rationality to it. I'm not
as a divorced heterosexual man. I want to tell you.
You want to take a walk on the gay side now, Doug?
No. I know. I've thought about that.
Happier.
No, yeah, I might be. I might fucking be happier. But you know what?
They don't call it gay for nothing.
I'm unfortunately, there are some new tricks that an old dog can't learn. But no, but I would say I don't feel like heterosexuality is any kind of fucking walk in the park, or you know, doesn't have its own kind of deviancy, or isn't fraught with narcissism, pathologies.
Right.
You know, like, you know, yeah. So,
but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
In other words, I'm just willing to say, because I'm looking at the right, like the avowed right. Obviously, the Democrats are also the right, and not just by relative standards. They are actually reactionary right-wing people. They are, in their own way, right? They're upholding all sorts of. I mean, if just the identity essentialism is right-wing, it just is. And but the avowed right, who are like freaking out over trans, and they're looking at it and they're like, oh, this is like the fall of the Roman Empire type shit. Like, this is like collapse of civilization type shit. You know, they're like looking at like 30% of young people are LGBTQ. What the fuck's going wrong with society? And I'm like, you know, there might be a point. You know, in other words, maybe it is an index of social pathology, actually, and it's not to be encouraged, right? And can
I tell you what I think about that? This is, maybe I'll censor this out. I think that if it were the case that all of these kids were really gay or feeling gender dysphoria, then that would not be an index of social pathology per se. But what I find
it might be people giving up on marriage and stuff like that. It might be giving up on happy families. It might be negative. May not be for a good reason.
Right. Well, this is what I'm saying. I feel that people grab onto not being gay or lesbian, but being queer, particularly, as a way to circumvent the need to mature into any kind of adulthood.
Yes. In other words, that's the other right-wing thing, is like homosexuality is a phase, and they're doing that with trans now. They're saying don't do hormone therapy and surgery because it might just be a phase. Like 8 out of 10 kids who think that they're trans is just a passing phase, it's just adolescence. That might be true. And maybe even homosexuality is a phase, but then it's a phase that people get stuck in. You know, I mean, I
know a lot of,
you know,
I know a lot of middle-class women, college educated, who went through a freaking phase of being in lesbian
lesbian,
yeah, and that does happen. I happen to think
gay men, and I'm like, are gay men just sexually stunted, that they're just like afraid of the pussy, that they just never had sex with a woman and they just get stuck in a pattern?
None of the gay men I've ever met have never had sex with a woman, but that's you know, off to the side. But so I don't believe that as the majority.
Right, as a reason. Okay,
yeah. But I do think, my feeling is, now we're just talking bullshit here. This is my opinion based on little or nothing.
Right.
Is that for men, bisexuality is generally a phase before they decide they're actually gay, and for women, bisexuality is just like a straight. Yeah, I don't know why that is the case, but I as a straight guy, I feel like I understand women not really being that attracted to men and having to work their way up to it, like drinking coffee or something like that. You know,
maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, there might be cultural patterns, and you know, obviously, sexism and misogyny and weird heterosexuality and heteronormativity and sort of unappealing sexual practices might play a role.
Oh,
you know,
for sure.
I'm not going to say, you know, that we live in a rape culture,
no.
Right? The way like some radical feminists will say. And which some Maoists will say too. I told you there was like a Maoist International Movement notes like article during Me Too that was like, the reason women feel depressed after sex is because, yes, they've all been raped. And I was
Do
like,
women feel depressed after sex?
supposedly, supposedly, yes, supposedly, and it's like, you were raped and you didn't even know it, right? It's some kind of Andrea Dworkin type stuff. But this is Maoism, in other words, some kind of Marxism and some kind of whatever, social justice, Maoism, some social justice, Marxism. And I'm just willing to just say that this kind of thing, I'm not going to be prescriptive about it. In other words, in any respect, I'm just going to say we really don't know how much of what we are living in now is a pathology of capitalism in all sorts of ways.
Yeah.
And so I'm just going to say, I think that people should be treated fairly and not abused and not discriminated against. And that doesn't mean that their lifestyles are particularly good,
Right.
or healthy or anything. Good for them, good for the public. Good
Yeah,
for society,
my
good
general feeling
culturally.
is that sexuality and sex is a morass. And it's not, it's neither, it shouldn't be what you look to for
Shouldn't
political
be
liberation.
political.
Yeah. And it's also not, shouldn't be the center of a conservative politics either, as a way to create a better, to preserve some sort of value. It's not like what we need to do is preserve particular values.
But this is what we're talking about. We're talking about, like, should the government give like child tax refunds, and and should they encourage companies to give paternity leave as well as maternity leave as like a kind of a gender equity kind of thing. I mean, this is the world that we're living in, and the capitalist politicians are going to try these various policies. They are.
Right.
And the point is they're going to be more or less just, more or less unjust. And they are going to have unintended consequences, knock-on effects. And again, like, socialists should steer clear of what are clearly exigent capitalist circumstances and interests. I do, like, it's like Yasmin Nair, had a critique of gay marriage as being like conservative. She's right. In other words, like, yes, people should have a right to be married if they want to be, but the idea that you're going to compel people to get married now, and, like Joe Biden said to Anderson Cooper, he's like, I support, Joe Biden said in the 2020 election in the town hall with CNN to Anderson Cooper, who's gay, he said, Anderson, I supported gay marriage because before gay marriage, it was just 24/7 in the bathhouse. And he said, Anderson, you know what I mean, right? And Anderson was like, I don't know what you mean. Like, don't make it seem like I was in the bathhouse 24/7, right? And so it was just a clear example of how, like, basically a homophobic heterosexual guy could support gay rights out of his homophobia,
right?
Or something, right? And,
or it's not just homophobia, but
or some kind
strictly conservative sexual
puritanical
moralism.
something, right? And and I'm just like, I don't think that.
And there's a perverse fantasy for Joe in that.
Well, that's the other thing. I always tell my students, I'm like, when he said that, that he's jealous. That he wishes that sex could be as easy as going to the bathhouse.
Right. And like, when I said, you
right.
said maybe you'd have more fun if you were gay, and I was like, I probably fucking would be.
It's a fantasy, right? It's a
Right,
fantasy,
yeah,
and it would come with its own miseries, but it wouldn't be the miseries of heterosexual dating. It would be the miseries of gay dating or gay bathhouses.
Yeah,
or
which
whatever.
I understand are pretty Byzantine, is so
and miserable.
Yeah,
absolutely. Right. And so it's just one of these things where how do we get back to basically a civil libertarian perspective on these things?
Right.
And as essentially that is historically what socialists' approach to this was. And really what they did was they started getting into, like, it's really in the Stalinist era that they got into adjudicating what was good and bad culturally, the left and Marxists. And they did that as a concession to the conservatism of society, which they shouldn't have done. But now, of course, it's kind of like all communists, like it used to be all communists have to be anti-gay.
Now they all need to be
pro-gay. They need to be like pro-gay or gay, like you're like an unreliable comrade unless you are trans.
Right.
Right. If you're not,
but even then, you're unreliable. Let's be real here.
Well, because of internalized white supremacy, internalized heteronormativity, internalized cisgenderism, internalized this and that, and and it's kind of like again what we were talking about in the first half. It's like, we're not going to police people's thoughts. We're not going to be able to. We shouldn't want to. We shouldn't want to police their feelings, surely, but But the other thing is that the other authoritarianism, people want to be told what's right to feel and what's right to think. That's the other really miserable part of it. And they're really scared of themselves. They're scared of their own feelings and their own thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't know how to have bad thoughts, have evil impulses, evil feelings. Like, they can't sort of sit with things with like ugly imaginings and work through them,
mm-hmm.
And so it's a very repressive time that we're living in. So it's an interesting, it's again, I feel like I'm bringing up Marcuse, repressive tolerance or repressive desublimation.
Mm-hmm.
Really repressive desublimation is what we have, right? We have like all sorts of drag queens and all sorts of non-body shamed and all sorts of perverts on screen all the time, 24/7. And it looks like a circus, like to the right, it looks like a circus of decadence. But to my mind, it looks like putting a smiley face on something deeply repressive.
I mean, you look at the drag queens that you see on TV, right? How often do you think they're actually fucking? I mean, like,
well, they might be. There might
the ones
be.
that the ones that go to these libraries and do story hour. I mean, why aren't they at the drag shows? At after midnight.
Why aren't they doing something else? Right.
Yeah,
why aren't they doing something else? And and maybe they've become totemic figures. I was thinking about that too. I was thinking about like drag queen story hour, and how a lot of like well-meaning straight people like to take their children to drag queen story hour. And I'm like, okay, so they've become the funny shaman kind of totemic figures,
right?
Of like they've become like the holy people, or like the sacrificial victims, really. In other words,
right?
And I was thinking about that. I was thinking about how like, there was some Fox News thing where they were talking about like an athlete who objected to a drag show in a halftime performance.
Mm-hmm.
And then it had to be very contrite and apologize and say some of my best friends are trans, which is probably not true, and this kind of thing.
The drag show isn't anyway, yeah.
Right, but I was thinking it's a funny thing that we're living through where it's becoming like a new kind of cultural totem. So in the past, it might have been like, hell yeah, like, shooting your gun in front of an American flag and, America, right? Mm-hmm. But now it's going to be trans people of color, right?
In some areas, yeah.
That's the new totem. Or like, one of our right-wing like ex-platypus people who quit was like on Facebook saying, oh, are we fighting in Ukraine because Ukraine flies the rainbow flag? And I was like, I'm not sure about that, right?
Right.
And so, but again,
that's buying into the pro-war rhetoric. It's
just funny, don't you think? And because it's like, well, see, look at how homophobic Russia is, and look.
Yeah, unlike the Nazis, the literal Nazis fighting in the
Ukraine against the Russians.
Yeah, I mean, I interviewed Sohrab Ahmari.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's going to be coming out in August because he has a book coming out around then. But in the second half, we talked about drag time story hour or whatever the
right. Mm-hmm.
And because he apparently was one of the first people to write a screed against it as a decadence and all of that.
He's one of these people. I mean, he was on with Ben Burgess and he said something like, we will disagree over gay marriage. And I was like, so Rob, you really going to disagree about gay marriage?
Right. What I said to him about the story hour is like, looks to me like it's kind of tacky. and I wouldn't bring my kids to that because it seems like kind of low culture to me. Like it's I wouldn't bring my
Twerking,
kids. Yeah, like nah,
it's working for toddlers,
it's not even like the sexualized aspect of it. It's
which is
just
really an entertainment for the parents and not for the children.
I
Because the
wouldn't take
children
my
have no
kids.
idea what's going on,
I
right?
wouldn't take my kids to see a mime at the library either, right?
It's too kitschy. Yeah.
yeah. So like this is just but if people want to take their kids to see these, like these people are halfway between clown and lady, is what I said to them. What difference does that make to anybody? You think these kids are at 6 or 5 listening to Goodnight Moon being read by a man in a gigantic red wig are gonna what? I
It
mean,
doesn't harm them. It's
yeah,
pretty
right.
harmless. I mean, the idea that it's actually doing a good though is the problem. In other words, like the
Well, you
I
don't
think
have to buy into that. You don't have to say, "Oh yeah, I'm teaching my child who
to be
doesn't even
tolerant,
know
to be
that they're a
accepting.
boy or a girl, or might
Right.
be, you know."
There's that too. There's this idea that the parent is going to let the child choose their own gender, which I guess that's okay, but it sounds like it's going to be rather confusing.
You know what? I didn't let my kids choose their gender, but if they wanted to wear their hair long, or one of them wanted to wear their sister's dress for a while, it's like whatever. They're 4, they're 5,
Exactly. Right.
you
Right.
know. Yeah. So like whatever. That was not, and none of my kids suffered any major confusion about their gender. As they lots of other things were confusing. Most of all, communism. They were all deeply confused by communism as they came of age. But that was my fault.
No, but it's a funny thing, right? So you wonder, it's a strange time that we're living in because, again, on the one hand, tolerance and acceptance
Mm-hmm.
and diversity, these are great ideas. I mean, it's all diversity, equity, inclusion. It's all like great ideas. I'm concerned about the extreme moralizing around it because I think we've talked about this. It's a kind of a wind up for a backlash, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think I don't want to be a symbol of anything, right?
Yeah.
I don't want my sexuality. I don't want my biological sex. I don't want my gender identity. I don't want my skin color, to be a political symbol, right? Because I just think that that's inherently dehumanizing. And so, to turn it around like trans rights is human rights, that's the way it's put, right? Is of course very true.
Mm-hmm.
But that is completely true. At the same time, right, it has that Black Lives Matter kind of quality to it. The all lives matter is like white supremacy,
Mm-hmm.
but Black Lives Matter, right? Because I just feel like, okay, but what are we doing when we're making a symbol out of Black life?
Mm-hmm.
A cultural symbol, a virtue signal. That's really wrong. That's really off.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a setup. It's a setup for minorities to be attacked as symbols.
Mm-hmm. Not as symbols that are universal, but as symbols of something in society that's going wrong. Basically,
But also
scapegoating.
a symbol for universality. Horkheimer and Adorno in the Dialectic of Enlightenment talked about how Jews, as a tiny minority, they were a tiny minority when the Nazis exterminated them, that they symbolized the universal, and that's why they were targeted, because people were unhappy with capitalism, and so Jews became the symbolic representations of capitalism because they represented like this cosmopolitan, like universal order that seemed to be taking leave of people's local communities and concrete lives.
They symbolize this contradiction within capitalism and inequality within capitalism. They were scapegoated.
Yes.
That's But yeah,
And that's also, even though Jews were seen as like rich people, but that could also happen with subaltern minorities. In other words, I saw that growing up in terms of like the everyday racism. That like insofar as the state was seen as on the side of black people, then black people came to symbolize the system, bearing down on the small person.
and that's being done more and more now.
Yeah. And I feel like what a setup of resentment that is. In other words, it's like, you know, my mother's like a landlord. What that means is that she has an apartment above her apartment, and she's not renting it. And the reason that she's not renting it, so she used to rent it to a black person, but now she's afraid of renting it because she's afraid that she'll be forced to rent it to a minority. And I'm like, but Mom, you've rented to minorities like most of the time. And she's just like, yeah, but I don't want to turn someone down because I don't like them particularly and be accused of racism. Right? In other words, she's like, I want to choose who I rent to. I don't want the first minority person who shows up for me to have to rent to them. Otherwise, I'll be accused of racism. I want to feel comfortable with the person.
She still can do that. I mean, I think that's a little paranoid.
Well, but policies are stricter now. Things have changed, you know, and it is in the air. And even on a place like Long Island, right? And so it's just, but it's one of these things where it is a little bit paranoid, but she's been set up to be paranoid and to resent. And then for people of color to symbolize that state authority bearing down on her. And that's such an unnecessary evil consequence of this bad politics.
Right.
The racial brokerage Democratic Party politics. It's just like so unnecessary. In other words, you can do other things, right? But they really like setting up minorities to be victimized, because then the minorities have to turn to them to be dependent on them. It's like, I swear to God, they want homophobia so that as a gay person, I have to vote Democrat. It really is like that.
No,
right?
I agree to a degree. Yeah. I mean, I don't know how conscious it is, but
it's not conscious so much, but it just suits them or something. And it's kind of like, it suits them to believe that there's this.
Do you remember when there was a shooting at the gay disco?
Yeah. Orlando,
right? And
he was an Islamist.
Yeah, he was an Islamist.
And it might have also been a closet gay.
You know what? I don't think he was. I think that was misinformation, or not. God, I'm using those terms. That was a rumor.
Factually incorrect. Yeah.
Yeah, it was factually incorrect. But it turned out that he was motivated by the politics, you know, of Islamism, and he had, you know, and also had lots of troubles in his life, but did not know that it was a gay nightclub per se.
Right.
But when the attack happened, I remember watching, I guess this guy, Owen Williams, I think something like that. He's a British commentator, young guy. And he was on news.
Is he the Chavs guy?
Huh?
Is he the Chavs guy?
No, he's a left wing.
No, you know what I mean. There's a guy, Owen, I forget his last name now, who wrote a book called Chavs about how the left has stigmatized.
Owen Jones is his name.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
I think that's him.
Owen Wilson is the actor.
Right, yeah.
Owen Jones.
And you said Owen Williams, who is
did I?
Nobody. He might be a football player in some high school.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Owen Jones. Owen Jones. Yeah. This is 52, but I think I would be like this anyway. Owen Jones was on a British Sky News. It's on Sky News.
So Rupert Murdoch.
Yeah, and the commentators were saying, well, do we really know what motivated this mass killing? You know, he was apparently Islamist. It could be that he just is resentful of the West in general. Maybe he targeted this because of what homosexuality represented to him, but we don't know. And Owen Jones was like, we know what this is. To claim that this is anything other than a homophobic attack on my people right now
is itself homophobic. Yeah.
is homophobic and is offensive and disgusting. And he got up and walked out.
Oh
Right.
man.
And
Doesn't help that it's a right-wing channel, right?
Right. True. But the truth was, we didn't know. And in
Right.
fact, that wasn't what happened.
Right.
And but there was a desire for that to be the story, and also to conflate that homophobia, that if it had been homophobia, with a generalized homophobia throughout the West and UK and the United States.
No, we had a version of that with Me Too, believe all women, right? Which, is just about fighting against a sort of sexist default, right? But then it's turned into a kind of an absurdity of like, we should pretend that there are no false accusations, which isn't exactly what's meant. But it is meant that maybe women are not going to be believed, or really women aren't going to feel that they're going to be believed. And so we have to say believe all women in order to encourage women to make complaints when they are abused and to overcome their fear that they won't be believed.
Yeah, you have to believe all women to the way in which you would believe any tip of a crime so that you can investigate it. Don't just brush it off.
Right, don't brush it off. And also encourage people to come forward.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of like, I kind of get it, I understand. But also it's kind of like you're playing with fire here. Because what you're doing is you're overcompensating against a sexist stereotype in all sorts of ways. Because, it might be a sexist stereotype to say that women are less likely to come forward if they're abused. I don't know. If a man is sexually abused, are they more likely to come forward?
No, it's less likely for a man to come forward.
Yeah, right? And but it feeds a sexist stereotype in the name of anti-sexism, actually.
The truth is, people who are sexually abused are less
generally
likely to
don't come forward. Right.
Right.
And there are all sorts of reasons for that, because they feel ashamed at their own victimization. It's terrible. It's a horrible thing, but that doesn't mean the tender mercies of the state are going to come in and correct it.
Right.
Or of the corporation, because the corporation only cares about lawsuits. They don't really care about the well-being, because they can't. How could they? It's not in their purview. They just couldn't really. So they have to sort of pretend to. But really what they're doing is doing liability limitation, which is fine. That's rational. It's okay. It's not particularly evil. It's just whatever it is, right? Just like, again, sober. We got to deal with things soberly, practically. Like, why do things actually happen, rather than our, fantasy version and our symbolic, over invested, over cathected kind of image.
Yeah, I feel like we have such a large task ahead of us right now, as people who want to revive a left which does seem to me to be rather dead, and so many different afflictions are
I'm very proud of the article that I wrote for Sublation, Dogmatization and Thought Taboos, because I addressed just this, and I actually invoked Sohrab Ahmari there, because I just said, in our middle class world, and yes, I'm a proletarianized element of the middle class, meaning I'm a part-time adjunct faculty, but I'm immersed in this milieu of the upper 20%, which is something like Norman Finkelstein says, it's not really the 99 and the 1%, it's really the 20 and the 80%. And we are solidly in that 20%. And, maybe not by income, but by cultural milieu. And, I take some solace in the fact that the working class is immune from this. In other words, they don't think this way, they don't act this way, they don't, and they're not going to. Even if they do sort of conjuncturally, temporarily, exigently, they have to play into it in order to do this and that. Generally speaking, this is not the way people are actually living, right? And therefore it's a wide open field. In other words, it's not like we have to really fight for a kind of civil libertarianism at the level of culture, ultimately to organize the working class for socialism. We don't. Now, what do we? Where are we having our arguments? In the milieu of intellectuals who the working class needs to be socialists, right? And so that's like the left, right? So the left is not a social category. It's not like workers are on the left, or racial minorities are on the left, or queers, or trans people are on the left. The left is an ideological category. It's the purview of intellectuals. And so the dogmatization and thought taboos are a harm to the struggle for socialism because of what they do to the intellectuals. And they really take what need to be it's obviously most intellectuals are going to support the system. So most intellectuals are going to fall for the Democratic Party or the Republican Party stuff. They are. And they're going to be corporate drones, and they're going to do this intellectual work to maintain capitalism. And God bless them. They'll do their thing. Some intellectuals need to be socialists.
Mm-hmm.
And Marxism is a tool for helping clarify that intellectual task of socialists, right? And so it's not like we have to win some kind of miniature culture war on the left. We're not going to, because the left are Democrats. They just are. We just need to understand that. And they're not going to be anything else, and it's fine. But, there should be some space, especially if people are talking about Marxism and socialism. There should be, I just feel like it's a point of intellectual honor for me that these ideas ought to be considered free and clear of this noise that we're bombarded with nonstop.
Mm-hmm.
And we should just, again, be able to operate at different levels, realize that we are being constantly bombarded and manipulated, and we are participants in the culture. We are inevitably, and we are in this milieu of the PMC, technocracy, and whatever, and the NGO world, and the corporate, woke capitalist world. And it's not like we're just going to be the deep agents always against it or something. We just have to sort of be able to bracket it. Just sort of be able to breathe outside that, just be able to think. There's just some mental space to think. Free and clear of this.
I agree. And I think that's a great place to stop for the second half.